From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Hello, welcome back. Our guest today is my boss, Washington Examiner commentary editor Tim Carney. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
But before we get to issue 1, we're just going to go round and have a quick little sharing of thoughts on the passing of President Bush. So, Pat, do you want to start us off?
Sure. George Bush was an American patriot who served his country with honor and distinction. Beginning at 18 years old when he joined the Navy to be a Navy pilot right after Pearl Harbor and all the way through the presidency of the United States. And he comes from and he fathered a tremendous family which has served its country for years.
I don't know.
He was a member of the greatest generation, and he is actually served with great distinction. And when he was president, he conducted diplomacy with great distinction. And I have to say, you know, Pat ran against him, challenged him in the primaries in 1992, right? Okay, and Pat delivered a speech at the convention known as the Culture War speech. And so that was, I think, the dividing of politics, not only in the Republican Party, but throughout. And I think we're remembering George H.W. Bush now as a sort of an avatar of the old establishment order, which I think a lot of us are yearning for today.
Okay, Tim.
Well, I'm not yearning for the old establishment order. I came of age politically as the Republican Party was making these changes, but I did today, with Donald Trump as president, it's worth thinking, yeah, George H.W. Bush was no conservative's favorite president. I mean, the tax hike above all else, but then also when conservatism's about more than just policy, and the way that he really did serve his country and was a devout family man and made that clear, that is something that we have to realize. I as a conservative, I miss that part, even if I'm not yearning for the old establishment.
Yeah. I agree with all that's been said. What's interesting is that George H.W. Bush was a moderate back when moderate wasn't a dirty word, right. But we were on the way to our polarized politics of today, where it has become such. But that was a great act of courage that he made for the sake of fiscal stability to after having promised not to raise taxes, find it was necessary, so he did it. It probably cost him his re-election. But one thing that I will also remember, though, was the personal side. He wrote so many personal notes to people, even members of the dreaded press, just because that was just the way he was.
Okay.
And,
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. I use the word establishment. That maybe is not the best word. He represented the New World Order after World War II, and he presided over the end of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall coming down. He didn't run around taking a victory lap either. He was very, and his signature phrase wouldn't be prudent. And when President Reagan, the assassination attempt, and Bush was out of the city, and when he came back, he didn't want his helicopter to land on the South Lawn. Yeah. Because only the president lands there. He was deferential to the institution.
But, you know, Tom, let me a quick, very short story. I had lunch with George Bush right in 1989, 1990, and he was in a cozy little room off the Oval Office, and he said, "Some of these people, Pat, want me to go dance on the Berlin Wall. Not going to do it."
Right.
All right.
But that goes right in with what you said.
Well, and the fact that he had lunch with you after.
Right.
All right.
This was before.
This was before. All right.
We're going to move on. My memory of George Bush, Eleanor's point about international order, was when he announced military operations against Iraq with Kuwait. He said it began with an attack on a small nation, and tonight the battle has been joined. That was America at its best. Anyway, issue 1, G20 to remember.
President Trump joined world leaders at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires, Argentina this weekend. It will be a G20 summit to remember. After all, the range of important interactions on the to-do list is vast. While President Trump will run into Vladimir Putin of Russia, the two men's planned meeting was cancelled over US anger at Russia's ongoing detention of Ukrainian sailors. But Trump will certainly have many things to discuss with China's leader, Xi Jinping. While both Trump and Xi have expressed a desire to reduce escalating tensions over trade and security, each has also threatened escalation. Also at the G20, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who has been blamed by the CIA, but notably not by President Trump, for the killing of dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey earlier last month. And while all this is going on, National Security Advisor John Bolton will be in Brazil, meeting President-elect Jair Bolsonaro.
Pat, many stories here. What's the biggest one?
I think the biggest one probably coming Saturday night, story tonight, if you will, after our taping. Xi Jinping and the President of the United States over the trade deal they're working out with China. The President's got out there as potentially putting tariffs of 25% on $500 billion worth of Chinese import. I don't think that's going to happen. They're going to try to work something out. But if they don't, people are actually talking about the U.S.-China relationship really collapsing across the board. You got security in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. You've got problems in tariffs and trade. You get the Chinese economy's in trouble. Ideologically, they're moving back toward a hardline communist regime.
Eleanor.
Well, if they work something out, it's probably not going to be at the G20. It'll probably just be getting China back to the table. I mean, this is not a big deal that he's going to be inking at the G20. I think the big story there was the buddy relationship between Putin and MBS, and they're clearly comrades in arms. And the president's, tap dance about whether he's going to meet with Putin, not meet with Putin. And the White House did put out a notice that the president did speak with Mr. Putin at dinner, and they did have a private talk. The Russians own President Trump, and I know we'll get into that into the next issue, and that was the overhang at that entire summit.
The big issue is that he actually did back down from this one-on-one meeting, and it just shows what's happening. Trump personally is too close to Putin. The Trump administration knows exactly who Putin is, and I think the canceling of the official meeting showed that once again.
What do you think is going to happen with the China trade situation? You think we might get a...
I think that both do want peace. I think that, at least the Chinese realize that the trade war is bad for them, and that Trump might be crazy enough to just keep going and hurt his own people.
I think the biggest story of the G20 is the overriding atmosphere of obsolescence. That the world order, as we've known since World War II, we're just talking about this in connection with George H.W. Bush, is really imperiled now by competition from isolationists and by those who prefer spheres of influence rather than broad alliances. And so fundamentally, the U.S. is not the leader now for the first time, really. And who is leading and what direction?
You take a look at what's going on in the eastern end of the Black Sea, in the Kerch Strait, in the Sea of Azov, where there's been a clash between Russian warships and Ukrainian ships that sort of tried to force passage into the Sea of Azov. But again, the interesting thing about this is that people are talking about sending a NATO flotilla into the Sea of Azov. It is not going to happen. People are beginning to realize that our national interests do not include us getting involved in everybody else's quarrel all over the world.
Yeah, but you could do something short of sending a flotilla into the Sea of Azov. You could put some pressure on the Russians, which this administration has done very haphazardly, always holding out the possibility that sanctions will indeed be lifted. And again, back to the relationship between Trump and Putin. It hangs over everything.
Peace with Russia is not a bad idea.
I didn't say it wasn't.
Every time we think, well, we got everything settled as far as international relations, we suddenly find we're heading back toward another war, partly because we try to be too isolationist too soon, and that's the concern here. But Donald Trump is very transactional. He's very much focused on making a profit as long as he feels like there's that possibility with Russia.
Take isolation, what you know about. Look, all the Democrats, as well as about 17 Republicans that have voted to get the United States out of that horrific war we've been fighting and aiding the Saudis in Yemen. And the idea of a realistic foreign policy, which, where you don't say automatically it's us versus them. There's a lot of different players in it. I think that is really coming to the fore.
I agree with that, but you don't have to be an isolationist to say we shouldn't be involved in the war in Yemen. I mean, it's a grotesquely fought war. There are no U.S. interests at stake. And again, it's because of a bet the president has made with MBS.
Obama and Trump
Let's bring Tim in.
it.
Let's bring Tim in. Tim, do you see any opportunities for the United States in terms of things that Trump is doing in an internationalist sense better than President Obama?
I think that the common sense of that our foreign policy should serve U.S. interests. What he might say, America first. What some people call isolationist is very prudent. And that is something that is probably where most of the American people are, is we shouldn't fight wars to advance either some ideology like George W. Bush did, or to advance, to be the policers of human rights like Clinton and Obama did. And so Trump is getting us back on that narrow thing. Our foreign policy is to protect America and serve America's interests. It's common sense, and we haven't done it.
What's common is the idea we all want to protect American interests. What is not common is how do we do it best?
But,
and do we do it by just letting them handle their affairs the way they want to? I mean, there's a corrosive effect when you're sending money to help the Saudis do criminal acts in a place like Yemen.
Let him finish.
Which can come back our way, as it did with World War I, if you want to go back that far.
Unfortunately, he inherited that from Obama, the whole Saudi-Yemen.
Let's blame Obama first, but Trump's got to find the cure now. Okay?
Let's go back to George H.W. Bush. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, Desert Storm, we threw them out and sent them back home.
Right.
His son sent an American army up to Baghdad to turn the place into a version of Iowa.
Not a good idea.
No, that is the difference between interventionism and something where you're looking out at least for somewhat of a national interest.
Right. And both.
And yet you opposed Bush. You opposed Bush. I mean, he did conduct an international form of diplomacy. He was very tight with our allies. The world has not changed to alienate that. I think that still works.
Russia and China both supported us in the Desert Storm, as did Syria. They supported us. Everybody in the world supported us but Jordan.
Here's a question, Tim. Do you think that there is an opportunity, though, with the rise of Prime Minister Modi, modernization close to the United States, because the Chinese have pissed them off? And I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but I did. Too late. But also Brazil, Bolsonaro, free market, perhaps the counterpoint to Venezuela.
So what Trump is good at is breaking outside of sort of old ways of thinking about it and looking for bilateral agreements. So we've, at the Examiner, we've written lots of things saying with the UK, with Japan, with other allies we can find, where there's common interest, let's do it and be very practical about it and not always worrying about large international trade deals. So I do think that he is, and he has lots of capable people. I like Pompeo there at State. He's got lots of capable people, and so there are those possibilities. And with regard to Russia, the biggest problem there is Trump's personal fondness himself, and that he doesn't quite see them for what they are. On the flip side of that, he wants to, the fact that he wants to have those good relations, I think he needs to, though, establish that balance between everything is transactional, and the U.S. has an obligation to not put a stamp of approval on immoral actions by bad leaders.
I know, but there are all kinds of bad people all over the world. Some of those fellows down there at Buenos Aires, Erdogan's got more journalists in jail than anybody else. He's a NATO ally. Our ally in Egypt has got about 50,000 members of the Brotherhood in there. We got tough customers in Central and Eastern Europe. You got to deal with the world as it is, and
we don't need to help them.
We cannot reform mankind.
We got to identify the bad guys, but we don't need to help them. We need to see what our interests really are.
With them if
when
you
they
want to
bring
have
out
peace.
the body saw and they start butchering people.
The bone saw.
But Eleanor, let me ask you a
That's
question.
where you draw the line.
Eleanor, is there a challenge that we've seen Putin and MBS, as you mentioned, buddy-budding? Is that a reason why the United States has to maintain a relationship with the Saudis? Otherwise, the Russians usurp all that money, all that relationship?
Let's bring back President George H.W. Bush again. Nuance. Policy is about nuance. Governing is about nuance. Diplomacy. Nobody's asking this president to cut off all ties with Saudi Arabia. That's unrealistic. But you don't exonerate
we're moving on.
butcher who's in charge.
Quickly.
One point. After Tiananmen Square, the massacre in Tiananmen Square, George H.W. Bush had Eagleberger and Scowcroft over there almost immediately repairing relations. You got to deal with the real world.
All right, real world.
So
anyway,
he's
when we
come
come back,
Bush too.
Mueller, Manafort, and Trump. Also, stay with us during the break as we hear from some experts about how to improve our nation's schools. It's the focus of a new report called Promise to Practice from the Collaborative for Student Success.
Welcome. I'm very excited today to be joined by some education experts to talk about education. To my immediate left, we have Hansel Kang, the State Superintendent of Education for the District of Columbia. Next to her, Candace Hines is a kindergarten teacher in Tennessee. And next to her, Doug Mascar, who has served in senior roles at the Department of Education and in Congress, and is also an adjunct scholar at the Lexington Institute. What do you think we need to do next? What's our next move with what we've learned so far with these reforms?
I think the urgency and taking a glance to make sure we are keeping students at the center of all our thoughts. Education was my way out, and I think keeping that in mind whenever you're implementing any practice or policy, that what we do in education is truly their future and their way out, is the harsh reality for many of our students today.
A lot of people think this education is just an intractable problem, but you see that we've got some options here now.
It's their life. Truly, their life and their future can be at stake.
Issue 2, the Manafort-Mueller misery.
It was a hectic week for former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort and special counsel Robert Mueller. Mueller shocked the nation when he announced that Manafort had reneged on a plea deal to cooperate with the special counsel's investigation into possible Trump campaign collusion with Russia. Manafort's lawyers challenged the special counsel's assertion, and a federal court will now decide on the matter. In other Mueller-related news, President Trump escalated his Twitter criticisms of the special counsel's prosecutors. And former Trump Organization lawyer Michael Cohen claimed that he held discussions with candidate Donald Trump well into 2016. If true, this would conflict with President Trump's previous statements.
Eleanor, how bad a week was this for the president?
It was very bad for individual number one, which is how the president is identified in the plea agreement with Michael Cohen. And Michael Cohen basically blew the lid off on the series of assertions that the president made while he was running for president and while he was president, or is president, that he didn't have any dealings with Moscow, when it turns out that Michael Cohen is basically attesting to the fact that they were aggressively going after this deal. They were offering Putin a $50 million suite at the top of a Trump Tower in Moscow, and they were dealing with the top aide to Vladimir Putin. So the Russians have known for the last 2 years that what the president has been saying is a big lie. What else do the Russians have on him?
What else do the Russians have, Pat?
Well,
if
first
anything?
let me talk about that whole situation. There's nothing wrong. It's a foolish thing to do, but there's nothing wrong with him working to build a big hotel if you think you're going to lose the election. It's a dumb thing to do. But why did he not tell the truth about it? The problem is, credibility is a problem, it's a political problem. I don't think there's a criminal problem unless in writing out those questions for Mr. Mueller, somebody said something that can be double-checked and is wrong. So that's where the problem is. But I agree, it's been a very bad week for the president.
I think Pat's wrong and Eleanor's right here, and that might literally be the first time I've said those words. But
Mark your calendars.
there's something wrong no matter what. If Donald Trump was running for president, pretending to be running for president, really to juice his hotel business, which is something we all speculated, that's the most innocent interpretation of this that you put. He was, and if that's the case, then he was ripping off, exploiting all the Republicans who were voting for him or holding their nose for him, and he was, as Marco Rubio called him, a con man. And again, that's the most innocent explanation. Otherwise, he was running for president while cozying up to a foreign power who is a hostile foreign power and a murderous foreign power. There's no making this look good.
Clarence.
As we've seen from numerous examples, Al Capone and many others, lying to the FBI can be enough in itself to put you behind bars. So it's going to be interesting to see just as more and more of the truth comes out, just how much pressure.
Does anyone think some of these individuals are just quite stupid for talking to the FBI in the first place? Why
Well,
don't they say, can you
it's
get me a
when they're
lawyer?
all being gotten on is that, like Flynn, he lied about 2 phone calls that were perfectly legitimate for the National Security Advisor. But that's where they're going to catch him. But I'll tell you, let's talk about when you go down the road, obviously he's going to be looked for possible impeachment. The House will look over and say, are we going to convict this guy in the Senate? And is the country going to support an impeachment and all this nonsense we've been talking about and everybody's bored with?
It depends on
Eleanor, are you bored with it?
The president and his allies are trying to do just what you're doing, discrediting the investigation. Doesn't really matter. These aren't major charges, and because I think the president thinks his big risk is impeachment. It isn't, because if you don't have 20 Republican senators willing to join with the Democrats, he'll never get convicted. So that's pointless. And staying in the presidency protects him to a certain degree. Won't be indicted as long as he's president. But the legal jeopardy continues to rise for him. I don't know what happens once he leaves office, but it rises also for his family, particularly Donald Trump Jr. and maybe even now Jared Kushner and Ivanka. And I think it's disrupting him. As erratic and dangerous as he is, I think we see that behavior getting increasingly worrisome.
And yet, Clarence, he is the president. So surely there is an argument then to say, because he is the president, let us wrap this up so that he can focus one way or another on the nation's business.
Oh, you're in a hurry still, aren't you? You know, I'm sure Mr. Mueller is in a hurry too, but he keeps finding more stuff. This is the thing, and that is not good for Trump or his family. The president is protected by the Constitution insofar as it's a political charge, impeachment. But his family is so deeply involved in his dealings that he feels the pressure on his kids, for example. And the whole crime family image is not helpful to him.
And running the business is a fundamental problem. And we've said this from day one, that if you're going to have foreign businesses, that will always involve some sort of cozying up and sucking up to politicians. Even domestically, even if you're not playing a quid pro quo explicitly, there's always an implicit one. So there's just something inherently corrupt. He should have gotten rid of this business, run as far away from it as possible the second that he announced, but he didn't want to.
But that's exactly what he should have done. But I do believe he probably thought, look, I'm not going to win this thing. There's a high probability, and go ahead and keep on with the Moscow deal. But I do think he's honest in trying to deal with the Russians because he didn't want a conflict with them. I don't think he's being de facto bribed at all. But I do believe this. I don't know how we go through 2 more years of all of this stuff coming out of the special prosecutor and going or not going to the House, and that's all we're focused on in TV and the rest of it. I think it's seriously hurting the country on both sides.
We don't know if it's going to be 2 more years. It could. The climax could come a lot sooner.
How?
And Mueller is also looking at the collusion with the hacking, and there are going to be some indictments in that area. And if that kind of bleeds over into the Moscow
Roger
deal,
Stone calling Julian Assange is going to bring down the president.
Yes, you can grin at it, but
that's the campaign.
That is the smoking gun that would
if
link
that's
it
a smoking
to the
gun, we escape.
All right, what do we think about Paul Manafort? Obviously,
I think Manafort was bad news, and Trump should run from him as quickly as possible. And that Trump's fondness for him, expressed in tweets and public comments, is a little baffling. He was a foreign. I used to cover lobbying. Paul Manafort was a foreign agent whose clients were shady pro-Putin people in Ukraine, and that he was constantly enriching himself. And that when he was working for the Trump campaign, he wasn't really working for the Trump campaign. It's like Facebook, you don't pay for it because you're the product, not the customer. Trump was the product, not the customer.
But if Mueller declares this guy who I've got as my big witness is a confirmed liar, you put him on this. He's dead as a witness.
You corroborate. He has many other people, and he corroborates all the information. Manafort is a white-collar criminal, and so is President Trump. I mean, we are looking at this. It's like looking at the workings of a crime family. It really is.
Do we think here, though, that the American people are to some degree getting sick of this?
Well, American people, a lot of them were sick of it from the beginning, Tom. But no, let me tell you about the old days of Watergate.
Okay.
American people were sick of that too, until finally they woke up one day and they saw that Richard Nixon had resigned, and a lot of them started calling our newspaper and other places saying, "What happened?" The fact is, the case is building right now, and Watergate, have we reached that time limit
well,
yet?
No, well, we've got to remember
Watergate.
Watergate ended with the fall of Vietnam and 1 million boat people and a Holocaust in Cambodia. So that wasn't altogether good for the nation either.
Tim,
well,
let's go.
I don't think Watergate occurred because of Vietnam.
All right, let's go into a lighter topic. Obviously, with the new Democratic Congress coming in January, what areas do you see for potential compromise?
Well, everybody talks about infrastructure there, but the big question is, I think Chuck Schumer would give Trump a wall in exchange for lots of money to spend on, a tunnel in New York and all that other stuff. But the base would freak out. And so you're going to see the same thing you saw in the Republican Party after the Tea Party, which is the leadership wanting to get stuff done and the base saying no deals with Trump on anything.
Eleanor.
Well, H.R. 1, which is the first bill that's going to come out of the hopper, is about election reform and democracy reform. I don't see how Republicans can't sign on to that. And our election machinery does need bolstering, and it's outrageous, the suppression that has been allowed to go
Clarence,
on.
what about a new round of tax cuts?
I think that, well, the old round of tax cuts is being re-examined now because working class people aren't impressed by the cuts they got, and it drove up the deficit by a couple trillion. So I think we're going to see something else now that's aimed more at Trump's base.
The president said he'd be willing to pull back on some corporate tax cuts in exchange for
But, you know,
but he says things that you can't take
It's
it to the
going
bank.
to have to be revenue neutral, and to get through Nancy Pelosi's House, it's going to have to really tilt more toward the working middle class, which I don't disagree with. But how the Republican characters in the Senate, others are going to take raising corporate taxes or raising taxes on capital gains. Have they met Larry Kudlow yet?
They'll break out in hives. We know that, you know. But you know, one thing, Democrats seem to appreciate the workings of government and legislation more than Republicans do. There's more of an anti-government attitude on the right. I don't think the left is going to be as
conservatism is?
Absolutely, standing athwart progress. Right?
All right, let's hope for some entitlement reform. We'll be right back with predictions.
Oh, God.
For more than a century, the Greater Washington Board of Trade has focused on growing our regional economy. We work every day to foster collaboration, build pipelines for skilled workers, embrace innovation, and attract investment. We must think, plan, and act as a region to better leverage our shared assets so we can continue shaping and advancing a vibrant regional economy for the next 100 years.
Predictions, Pat.
On the Brexit vote that's coming up for Theresa May, the fact that the Labour Party is all against it, others in the centrist party are against it, and the conservative part of the Tory party, I think she's going to lose on the first vote. I don't know about the second.
If she loses on the second, does she lose her office?
Yes.
Okay, Eleanor.
Okay, Matthew Whitaker, who was installed as the acting attorney general to basically be Trump's eyes and ears, if not toady, did not object to the plea deal with Michael Cohen. And I think he realizes that if he intervenes with the Russian investigation, when the Democrats come into power in the House, they can subpoena him, ask him why he made certain decisions, or Robert Mueller could go public. So I'm thinking that Matthew Whitaker actually has a net around him.
Okay. Tim.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other Democrats are talking about a Green New Deal, and I predict with fair level of confidence this will become a massive corporate welfare boondoggle. The lobbyists will all love it. There will be handouts galore, and Ocasio-Cortez will either still hold it up as a shining thing or will run away, realizing the way Washington really works.
Clarence.
But there'll be solar power corporations.
Yes.
In Chicago, Donald Trump's former real estate lawyer, who got him a nice big tax break, happens to be Alderman Eddie Burke, head of the Finance Committee, and his offices were raided this past week, and windows covered with brown paper, and we're all wondering
Not
why.
a good sign.
All right.
I predict there's a connection between him and Trump here.
Okay, very interesting. Well, that's something to follow. Anyway, on that note, I was going to do a Brexit thing, but Pat stole it, so I'm going to blame him for that. Thank you very much for watching. We'll hope you'll all tune in again next week. Bye-bye.